There are times when you and I, as the pew-sitting rank-and-file Christians, have to think about how it is we're going to grow. Paul keeps talking about wanting the people he's writing to grow in their understanding and their wisdom and their Christian maturity. How do we all want to do it. We think, Paul, good idea. How do we do it? Well, a lot of factors come into play. One of them is the ministry we sit under. We sit under good ministry and we're being challenged and we're learning things and we're growing. And there's other ministry we can sit under which can be sort of comfortable, but we fall asleep. So how do we make sure we're under good ministry? Well, it comes into play in a couple of occasions in our lives. We move to a new town or suburb. We've got to decide which minister we're going to sit under. And maybe if you're in a church and a bloke retires or resigns and you're on the committee, you've got to decide who the new minister's going to be. So there are times when we need to evaluate the work of ministers. How do we do it? The man with the answers, the Dean of Sydney, Philip Jensen.
Hello, Kel.
Now, let me start with the second one, because I mentioned that sometimes we need to pick a new minister, and a church will meet.
Yep.
Sometimes the whole church will meet, sometimes a committee. Take us through the things we're looking for when we're looking for a new minister for our church. What do we want?
Well, we've got to go for the fundamental first, and you've got to keep first things first and never take them for granted.
Right.
That is, the personal godliness and the Christian knowledge of the orthodoxy of the minister is critical. And there's a tendency for people to get lazy on that. So we look for lesser things like whether he's warm and friendly and whether he's got good humour and those kinds of things.
And he's the right age group for our group of families and all that sort of thing.
Those things have a part to play, but they are minor.
Right.
The major ones are, is he a man of God?
Right.
Is he somebody who actually loves the Lord Jesus Christ and is ever thankful for the grace of forgiveness that's in his life?
Right.
And passionately concerned that others would know of Jesus and that Jesus would be upheld by the manner of his life and by the teaching of the Word of God. And so the fundamentals have to be fundamental in our search.
So conviction and character, is that the expression we're looking for?
Yes. There are three C's: convictions, character and competency.
Right.
Most people look for competency.
Yes, don't we? Yes, you're right.
Well, that's actually minor.
Okay.
The competencies that they have must be cradled, to put another C in, must be cradled in the convictions and character.
Right.
Now, our convictions and character come out of our knowledge of God.
Right.
That's taught to us in the scriptures and the gospel. That gives us our convictions, and our convictions shape our character. If a man is not shaped by the convictions of the gospel, then it's not the right character.
So we're looking for a godly man, and his godliness, his godliness is more important than his knowledge, but his godliness grows out of his knowledge.
Yes, that's right. There's a certain loop back there, isn't
Yes.
it? That as you grow in godliness, you come to understand better. As you understand better, you grow in godliness. So that spiral that he is on is very important if we're going to be following him. And it's infinitely more important than his competency, because if he's really competent but ungodly or unorthodox, he'll do terrible damage.
Right.
Better to have a total incompetent idiot.
Who says the truth, God's truth.
Yeah. Than to have, well, if you're going to pick a heretic, pick a completely incompetent heretic. Don't pick a very competent one, a very capable, smiling, lovely, wonderful one. That's hopeless.
I mean, that suggests to me that if I arrive in Galagambo and I'm looking for a new church for me and my family,
Yes.
I can't decide quickly. I'm going to have to maybe ask around if I've got Christian contacts, sit under someone's preaching, invite the minister around to lunch and get to know him. It's not going to be an easy thing to decide, is it?
No, although, in some ways it's not going to be easy because you've got to get to know the person. But most ministers are out there publicly.
Right.
You sit and listen to him preach. Well, he either is concerned about the things of God or he's not. He either is passionately concerned with what the word actually says or he's riding his hobby horses.
Right.
And in a town like Galagambo, whose name I can't spell, I can pronounce it. But
it really exists. I didn't make it up. There is a Galagambo.
There is a Galagambo. But in a town the size of Galagambo, everyone in the town will know what the minister's like, won't they?
Yes.
The problem much more is in a suburb in Sydney, where you can live a slightly more anonymous life.
Right.
But watching the character of their life, the character of the way in which he treats other people, who he talks to over morning tea.
Yep.
You know, the kindness he shows to people. There's whether he makes decisions that reflect the preaching that he's giving.
Yes.
That takes a little bit more time to see than listening to the sermon and working out whether he's teaching the truth.
If I'm in the other camp, if I'm in the camp of trying to pick a new minister, at what level do we do that choosing? Is it done by the local congregation, or do we say to the denomination, send us someone?
Well, both of those extremes you've given to us, or options you've given to us, are unhelpful. The fully independent church that has to choose their own generally hasn't got the tools, the mechanisms, the abilities to discern fully and properly the quality of a pastor. How do they know what the theology is that he's taught or learnt? How do they know the character of life? You know, you put out an advertisement, people apply. From an interview, are you going to be able to work out what they're really like at the depth at which you need to know it? It's a very difficult thing for a fully independent church. A denomination that just sends you ministers, well, it'll be looking after its ministers and after itself more than it will be after you.
And they could play the game of, well, he's unhappy there, let's move him.
That's right. So we'll solve the mess he's making there by moving him over there.
Yes.
It'll take another 5 years before he makes the equal size mess. But what a good denomination will do is educate a man properly, train him properly, screen him properly, and watch him over time to see that he is somebody who can genuinely represent the Lord Jesus Christ and genuinely represent their denomination, so that the local church, in its range of ministers to choose from its denomination, has the kind of denominational stamp of approval of these people.
Right.
That's not foolproof. A man gets ordained at 25, and by the time he's 45, he's changed his mind on a whole range of issues. He's changed his lifestyle. It's not foolproof. And anyway, clever, wicked people can pull the
wool over your eyes.
Wool over the eyes of a denomination.
Yes.
But you have got at least some safeguard that people who have got expertise in educating and training and selecting clergy have already done a basic qualification.
So if I said, look, it's our church, we're going to decide, but we want the denomination to help us decide.
Yep.
Is that the kind of structure you're talking about?
That is the kind of structure. It happens differently with the Baptist Union than it does with the Presbyterians, than it does with the Anglicans. They've all got their own mechanisms to do it. But the strength is to be able to have the denominational seal of approval and commitment to that person's training, with the congregational's freedom not to have someone imposed upon them, but to have some choice, because they're going to pay for the man, they're going to live under the authority of this man. They need to have some sense of voluntarily accepting this man.
Yes, and saying, you know, this is someone we're happy to be an authority over us. And
Yep.
Yes. Is it a good idea to work out at the start what the process is going to be, what the steps are, and then ignore the difficult person? On every committee, there's someone who should have been strangled at birth. And ignore the difficult person who suddenly says towards the end of it, let's throw it out and change the process. Is it good to work out how you're going to do it?
Once you're in a process of, at whichever denomination you're in, there's no point trying to fiddle the process.
Right.
Change denominations and get to another one with a better process if you like, but you've got to work within the construction that you've got.
Right.
Which will give you the degree of freedoms to make the choices you make. But trying to change the process midstream is a political disaster area, because it always looks like favouritism, special deals, that, you know, is he your third cousin? It just is not worth it.
When we get to a point of interviewing a minister, and it may be because we want him to come to our church, or it may be because I've invited him around to lunch because I've just come to Galaga, is it a good idea to ask him about something like his theology of ministry? I mean, he's going to be ministering to me. Is that a sensible question to ask a man?
It is a sensible thing to ask, but I think a better way of asking it is to see what he's doing.
Right.
The best predictor of future is present activity.
Right.
And so, rather than me asking him to explain it, which is not a bad thing to do, it's rather to see what it's at doing. Right. When I've seen what he's doing, I may then get him to explain to me why he does what he does.
Right.
Sometimes there's a complete disjunction between those two. He thinks he's doing one thing when he's actually doing something different. But what he is doing and how he does it will tell you volumes about what he will do in another context, such as yours.
So it's a good idea if we're looking for a new minister to visit his church, to have a look at the range of things going on, or if I'm picking a church in Galagabone, to visit the church and say what activities are happening, what ministry is going on here.
And in that process of looking, you say, well, why do you run a Sunday school at the same time as church? Why don't you have the children in the church? Why do you...
Yes, why is the Friday afternoon kids club, you know? And I know you've got a women's group and not a men's group, or whatever,
Whatever you see, you ask questions about what you see, rather than what's your theory.
Yep.
Because you can have wonderful theories, but what's done is what counts. Now, sometimes you can say, well, I don't like that, but that's what I've inherited, but I'm moving it
in this direction or
that direction. But sometimes there's what I call waterless clouds, people who've got terrific theories about all they're going to do, but nothing's ever seen on the ground.
So look at what's actually happening.
That tells you loads. And so when people say, I believe in preaching the Bible,
right,
but they never do. I was at a conference in Amsterdam once where every night the preacher carried Bibles, different preachers, world famous preachers, they all carried the Bible up to the lectern, and only one of them actually read from it. Several of them preached terrific sermons about how they always preached the word, but they didn't.
Yes. In trying to work out how we're to make sense of ministry that we're going to sit under, does the minister's family play a role? I mean, this can be slightly awkward, but if we get to know his wife and get to know the family, and is that helpful at all?
Yes, it's a bit tricky, isn't it? It is awful, because we're not employing the minister's wife, we're employing the minister.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll make that clear.
Yes, Shaz and quite rightly too. And yet, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1, when they're talking about choosing elders, which are not exactly the same as ministers, it depends on your view of eldership, but the ability to rule their own household is one of the key characteristics. And so you see a man's values and attitudes, not just in what he does, but what he does in his family, with his family, by his family. Now, it's not that the minister's wife must lead the Bible study. Some ministers' wives are no good at leading Bible studies. But is she committed to the gospel ministry as he is? Because if she's committed to her career, which has nothing to do with the church, and he's committed to the church and nothing to do with her career, you think, well, is this the model of family life that the Bible is teaching? Is this really a family that is going to lead us as Christian people? Now, I know some ministers' wives whose contribution to church life is just the running of their family well.
Well, if they've got young kids, and a lot of young kids, maybe that's a good idea.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
But it says something loud and clear about the character of their commitments. And I think that's, whereas others I've seen where money is really a driving, motivating factor. I mean, there's several I know where her business is really the predominant factor in the life, and his ministry fits around her business.
Right.
Well, if his ministry fits around her business, then you've got to start wondering how important is the gospel.
Now, you've been talking about central things, convictions, character, these kinds of things. Is it possible to get sidetracked and to be looking for minors rather than majors?
Yes. If you've got out your list of convictions, well, what are the ones that really matter, And so people then ask obscure questions, which, I mean, in one sense, every theological truth has its practical outworks and complications. But there are some, like justification by faith alone, which are really so central to the gospel.
Yes.
And there are others that the dating of Deuteronomy, not quite as central to what the gospel is, or who wrote Ecclesiastes. They're not the same degree of make or break gospel ministry.
I've actually seen it with eschatology.
Yes, very much so.
Where there's a big range of opinion amongst Bible-believing evangelicals, and some people only want their bloke.
And not only a big range of opinions, but a big range of opinions over minutiae.
Yes.
As to which,
pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib.
all that kind of thing, that's
Yes.
right. And you think, well, is this really going to make a difference? I mean, there's two churches I know in a country town, both tiny, both come from a Free Presbyterian tradition, but they don't have anything to do with each other because one uses the King James and the other doesn't use the King James.
Oh, right. Yes.
And you think,
yes.
well, what's the point of having both of you out of two different traditions when you theoretically believing fundamentally the same things, but you've got some minor differences that are very hard to see the importance of today?
Well, I've seen something happen where one group stood up to sing and sat down to pray, and the other group stood up to pray and sat down to sing.
Yes.
Now, you think, how can that be so important?
Yes, you wonder, don't you?
Yes.
And so there are a lot of secondary issues that people take, but some of those secondary issues are even outside of theology.
Right.
So, will you put your children into private school or do you believe in public school?
Oh, so that becomes an issue for
Yeah.
some people. Right.
Yeah. On both sides of the fences, because there are some congregations that are divided over how to raise children.
Right.
And so when they're choosing a minister, they'll be looking for the minister who's going to reinforce our side of the issue rather than be over on that side. Whether you vote Liberal or Labor.
Oh, right.
You know, what your political actions or attitudes, and you think, no, these things do not matter, or rather shouldn't matter. Then there's a whole range of ones where people say, well, we'd like this minister. We're talking about choosing a minister rather than whether you choose to go to a church, but you can put it the other way around too. We're choosing this minister because he will let us do the things that we've been doing already.
Ah, right.
And so,
Rather than coming along and saying, I've got a vision for ministry.
yes, and a pastor may want to take you somewhere different to where you've been, and it might be actually for your good.
Yes, yes.
And so there's, over time, churches build up little power groups, or whatever you're going to call them. And when it comes to a new minister, they often want to preserve their position. I've been running the Sunday school for the last 25 years. If he's not going to actually have me continue to run the Sunday school, then he's not the man I want.
Yes, yep.
When in fact what the church needs is someone who will come along and encourage me to leave. I should have left 15 years ago from running the Sunday school. But if I'm the kind of person who's on the committee who makes the choice, I choose to preserve my place by getting my man in.
Age can be one of these irrelevant factors. I mean, you could turn up in Galagamboan and there's this older man with white hair and he preaches the Bible and you think, that's wonderful, I haven't seen that. And then you go to another church and it's a younger bloke, doesn't preach nearly as well, but you think, you know, he's our age group, they've got kids out the age of our kids, we'll fit in with them.
Yes, but there it's a fundamental thing and a strategic thing. The fundamental's still fundamental. So his quality of ministry of the Word of God is fundamental.
Right.
And I'd rather have a better one of those irrespective of age.
Yep.
But all other things being equal on that score, if you're in a suburb which is full of young families, then a young family man's a good person to have.
Yes.
If you're in a...
All other things being equal.
All other things being equal. If you're in a suburb which is moving towards one large major ethnic group, like the suburb of Hurstville at the moment is full of Chinese people and growingly Chinese people, well then to be able to get a Chinese pastor is a sensible, reasonable thing to do. But that's a secondary issue.
Right.
Whereas things like whether he goes to public school or not, that's not even a tertiary, that's a should never be raised issue.
Yeah.
That's really relevant.
Way down the bottom of the list.
Yeah.
In fact, the risk with looking at the minor things is you can get the pendulum swing, where you can say,
Yes.
last time we had this sort of person,
Yeah.
he was a great preacher, but he never visited. Now we want someone who
Yes.
we don't care how he preaches as long as he's a pastor. We can do that pendulum swing, can't we?
It often happens, and it's a disaster every time it happens. And the more extreme the pendulum swing, the worse.
Right.
So I was in one church some years ago where they all groaned every time the minister preached. He was the only consolation was that he regularly got everybody else to preach rather than himself, and he knew that he wasn't a good preacher. That was the saving grace. So when he left, they immediately got the best preacher they could. And then 6 months later, people complained uphill and down dale because this new preacher did nothing but just prepare his sermons. That's all he did. He didn't visit hospital, he didn't run funerals, he didn't. He did preach very good sermons.
Right. So you've really got to work out what the priorities really are,
Yes.
and not just say, let's have a change.
Yes, the change is not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
With every package comes a package. You know?
Yes.
So, yes, he can preach really well because he doesn't spend his time visiting irrationally or
Yes.
everybody. Yes, he does visit everybody all the time, and that's why his sermons are no good. It's a package deal, and people focus on one aspect and then look for the alternative single aspect.
Right, so that's a mistake. We don't
Very
make
big
that
mistake,
mistake.
yes.
I don't move from Hurstville to Galargenbone and say we're going to find someone different to the last bloke.
Yep.
I'm going to find the right person.
That's right.
What about the risk of wanting a tame servant? Someone who will follow the dictates of the people who've been around for a long time.
Yes. The word pastor means shepherd.
Right.
A shepherd who only has one sheep has a very poor pastor.
Right.
In fact, after his barbecue, he doesn't have any sheep. You know, and it's just
A nice lamb sandwich, but no sheep.
no sheep. What a good shepherd does is he brings sufficient number of sheep to lambs into the world to be able to make sure that as old ones die off, more are still growing. He looks after the whole flock, not the individual. We keep using the word pastor when what we really mean is personal. A good personal worker is different to a good pastoral worker.
Right.
The pastor looks after the whole, not the individual.
Yes,
Now,
yes, yes.
in order to look after the whole, you look after an individual, but
The
for
focus
purpose
is
of
on the
whole.
mob. Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
So that when we're looking for a good pastor, we've got to be looking for someone who can actually manage
The flock.
the flock, not manage just one or two individuals. Now, what people want in the tame pastor is somebody that they can get to work under them for their interests. But now in Ezekiel chapter 34, God talks about coming to be the pastor and separating and shepherding out between the fat sheep and the thin sheep, and especially the fat sheep that rule over the thin sheep and starve the thin sheep, and how the pastor will actually judge in favour of the thin and protect them for the fat.
That's the whole flock view.
A whole flock view.
Yes.
And so if you get a pastor that you can lead, well, you haven't got a pastor, you've got a sheep. You're the pastor.
Yes.
So if you're going to be the pastor, well, quit your job and live like a pastor.
Right.
And see what it feels like to look after the whole flock.
Yes, quite difficult.
Yeah.
Churches go through a church life cycle, and
Yes.
it's a cycle where they climb and then flatten out and then die again, a bit the
Yep.
shape of...
Yeah, about 25, 40 years, the average church goes through the cycle.
If we know where we are on the cycle, or we know where a church is on the cycle, does that determine who the minister should be, or have a role in playing
Yes.
who the minister should be?
Really, that is much more helpful than minor issues and important issues. You still got to deal with, I want someone who's orthodox and godly,
Yes.
first and foremost.
That's
Whether
fundamental.
I'm on the way up, plateauing, or on the way down.
Yes.
But the kind of minister, the competencies, which are not as important as character and convictions, but are important, the competencies I should be looking for, if it's a growing church, and we've grown recently, then I shouldn't change the philosophy of ministry or the pattern of ministry, because I'm just going to kill the growth. So I'm really looking for someone who's going to reinforce and resource the growth that's already there.
Right. So you want a resourcer of the growth that's going on.
And yes, and I'll want the minister like the last minister. And in fact,
right.
I'll talk to the minister who's just leaving and say, well, who do you recommend that could carry on what you're doing?
Yes, yes.
If I'm on the plateau, well, if I go to the minister and say, who's someone like you who can keep us going the way you are, I'm actually saying I don't want to grow.
Yes. So what do you need then?
You need something. You need a reformer. That's
Ah.
the hardest, trickiest one to find, actually, because you don't want someone who's going to come and destroy it by making radical change, but you want someone who's clever enough and able to find the levers, to find the buttons, to change the character of the church so that it will grow without destroying the character of the church in the process.
I mean, I suppose you could say,
Very
how
hard.
would you reform? This church has been pretty steady for a long time. How would you reform it and see if they've got ideas?
Yes, that's a hard one to find, though. That
Right.
one. When it's in decline, there's no point just reforming it. You've got to reinvent it.
Right.
Now, that's a different kind of person altogether. That's the person.
That'd be pretty tough.
Yeah, well, it's tough, but it's a different kind of personality. It's
Right.
the kind of person who says, oh, well, that doesn't work, let's scrap that and do something completely different.
Right.
Now, when it just starts to decline, most congregations don't want anything changed. They are desperate. When you come down towards the end of the decline and nobody's much left, they say, well,
Whatever you want to do, give it a go.
give it a go, we've got nothing to lose anymore.
Okay.
It's really wise as churches start to decline to invite the reinventor rather than just the reformer.
Okay.
They want the reformer because he's only going to change some things, but they actually need a reinventor who's going to radically change things.
So they need to find someone with a real spark of creativity and energy and,
Yes.
and enough character to say, this is what we're going to do,
Enough
folks.
thick-headedness and backbone
Right.
to face up to the consequences also.
Looking at all of those things, let's go back to the basics and finish on that, because
Good.
the basic thing is someone who will teach the Bible prayerfully and lovingly.
Yes.
And whether we're picking a minister or whether I'm picking what church I'm going to go to, that's what I'm looking for, isn't it?
That's what I'm looking for. That he loves me in the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and wants my good. Now, my good is not always the same as my comfort. Not
Right.
the same as what I want.
I've heard sermons where I've thought, he's been reading my mail. I mean,
Yep.
that's a good thing.
Yes, that's right. He can make me feel very uncomfortable.
Yes. And
But I need to.
And the times when I walk out and think, I need to do something about that.
Yes, that's good, man.
So that's what we're looking for. If
Yeah.
we can find someone like that in Galargenbone,
Be terrific.
or someone like that when we're searching for a new minister,
Yep.
we're looking in the right direction.
Yep.
If we're doing interviews with the minister, just talking to the minister, we can ask questions which tell us this is a man who prayerfully
Yes.
teaches the Bible.
And there's another side to it, Kel, too. We're not going to go on to now, but you can explore. It's not just my choosing, but it's my praying for my minister.
Oh,
It's my
right.
encouragement of my minister.
Yes.
What do I want in my minister? So it's a tough job. It's a hard job in terms of the criticisms that you get. It's a really helpful job when 2 or 3 people actually pray that I will spend more time praying, that I will become more loving, that I will work harder at my sermons, and who give me encouragement to do so, so I can actually improve the ministry in my local church by my prayerful support of my minister.
So this coming Sunday, after church, in order to encourage your minister, go up to your minister and say, that bit in your sermon about verse 7, love that. I hadn't thought about that before. He'll be really astonished you paid that much attention, but he'll be really pleased and encouraged. So it's a good idea. Might get a good conversation going. Philip, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure, Kel.
And next time you're in Sydney, make sure you call into St Andrew's Cathedral to hear Philip Jensen teach the Bible. And thank you for your company this time on The Chat Room.